Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming this evening. This is a discussion about a book and a person, and we'll explain the format in a minute, but it's hosted by the Institute for Policy Research here at the University of Bath. So my name's Joe Devine. I'm an Associate Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research here at the University. And more importantly, or as importantly, I'm a colleague in the same department as Professor Yvonne Jewkes, who's not only the author of the book, but also one of our leading researchers in the university. So Yvonne joined the University of Bath in 2018, and the idea was really to catapult both our research profile as well as our teaching profile in criminology. And anyone who's observed over the last 4 or 5 years will have recognised, at least at Bath, the catapult has been huge and the impact immense. So criminology at Bath has really set itself at a pace which I've rarely seen, to be honest, at least in terms of our undergraduate and postgraduate programmes. So for those who don't know, Yvonne's academic expertise lies in the world of prisons, architecture, and driving home a message about how can prisons be better places for rehabilitation as opposed to punishment. We'll have time to discuss this as we go forward, but academically that's where she is. As we will see as we have a discussion about the book, she's allowed that academic interest and expertise to spill quite happily into her own passionate activist life. And so she's been very involved internationally in different countries about the design of prisons, no doubt having multiple arguments with people who were designing them, winning some of the battles, losing others, but it was really trying to carry forward her intellectual interest, I think, in the rehabilitative capacity of prisons to try and make an impact. Yeah. I was at an event the other night when our new Vice-Chancellor said what Bath should really be interested in is research of high quality, of course, like other universities, but research with purpose. And I think Yvonne is someone who brings that purpose very clearly to the forefront of research activity and initiatives. This has been evidenced in many ways, grants and publications, the usual thing that universities like to celebrate, but she's also received 2 very prestigious impact awards, which again goes back to this idea that there is passion and mission and objective and purpose driving our research. So we want to start the evening by welcoming Yvonne and thanking her for giving us the opportunity to have a conversation about her book. Format, well, first of all, as you can see at the side, Routledge have happily come along and their book's there for sale. If you haven't got a copy, I did, paid for it, read it and enjoyed it. I thought it would take me a few days. It took me a day. Because once it's one of those things, once you start, you keep guessing, where is she going next with this? And we'll have that conversation as we go through. So thank you to Routledge for coming. And again, the books are there, and Yvonne at the end will be available if people want to discuss the book in more detail with her. We're recording this, so it's being recorded as video, but the only people seen on the video will be Yvonne and myself. That's not the best thing to see, but that's what we've got. But when we have questions and answers, there will be audio, so if someone feels that they don't want to be recorded, just let us know at the end and we can always deal with that. But so that you know, we'll have a microphone that roams around, but it wouldn't be video recorded, it would be audio recorded. The format, we're going to have a bit of a conversation, but the conversation will be between us two, but we'll be looking this way deliberately because it's about trying to explain or ask questions about the book itself, on the one hand, but hopefully it opens up as well, for those who might not have read it, points of interest that we can later follow up through questions. Yeah? So it's going to be a conversation that kind of moves around a bit like this. And I've read it and set up some questions, but they're open-ended. So they will go in the direction that the conversation takes us. And we'll have that up until about 10 to 7. And then we'll have 20, 25 minutes or so of open questions and answers. And again, that can be straightforward question and answers, or it could be more in the conversation. That's completely up to us, I suppose. So that's the format we'll have. And what we decided we would do is start and end with a reading from the book. So I had asked Yvonne the other day to get a part of the book that she felt captures the essence of the book quite nicely. And she asked to begin with the foreword of the book, and I think it sets the scene perfectly well for the conversation that we might have. And then at the end, she's got a little caption or a bit of the reading which I think will be a really reflective and powerful piece for us to go away and think about and perhaps discuss with her at the end of the session this evening. So, thank you for coming. Thanks to IPR for hosting this. And again, thanks to Yvonne for making this opportunity a possibility for us all. So let's start, and we'll begin with Yvonne reading a part of the foreword to the book.
Okay, thank you, Joe, and thank you all for coming. So yes, I'm going to read the first couple of pages, the prologue, which hopefully will give a flavour of what the book is about. It's called Locked Up, Locked Down. 16th of September 2016, Halden Prison, Norway. The drive was in an ordinary car. They used police cars or civilian cars to take us to prison in Norway. I looked out of the windows and thought, this is going to be the last time I see grass and fields and sheep for a very long time. And I started to cry a little bit, just the thought of losing touch with nature and life and the outside world. Seeing sheep and cows brought it all home to me, the loss. I'll never forget that feeling. I'm sorry, that must sound really stupid. I contemplate the rugged, fair-haired Norwegian sitting in front of me. Arvid is in his late 30s, a quarter of the way through a 12-year sentence for a crime that might easily have seen him sent down for 20 years in the UK and longer in the US, perhaps even for life if it wasn't his first offence. I'm a decade older and a university professor from England, visiting Halden to ask prisoners about its famously beautiful architecture. But as I look into his straw-flecked eyes, I experience a profound sense of connection. I want to tell him about the time 20 years earlier when I found myself unable to breathe while giving a lecture. A hand gripped my insides, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I tried to inhale deeply, but could only manage shallow gulps. I ended my class abruptly and, trying to quell my panic, drove to the GP's surgery. With a bedside manner that left a lot to be desired, my doctor told me that I could be dead or brain dead by the end of the day. Across the silence, Arvid looks at me intensely. Holding his gaze, I take the plunge. Not stupid at all. I was once very ill. I had a blood clot in my lung. I had to get to hospital immediately or I could lose oxygen to the brain. But they didn't have an ambulance available, so my partner had to come home from work and take me to the hospital 22 miles away. I remember driving through the countryside, sheep and trees and green fields, and I had that exact same feeling. This could be the last time I ever see all of this. It's generally not considered good practice to disclose personal information to people in prison. But after 25 years interviewing men and women who have been locked up for every crime imaginable, I feel comfortable sharing my story with Arvid today. We're seated on opposite sides of a picnic table under a cloudless Nordic sky. The table sits on a patch of tarmacked yard outside the men's accommodation block, and an officer in a starch blue uniform is staring at us with bemusement from inside. Yet for a fleeting moment, a common humanity takes us away from the prison, outside of ourselves almost. Arvid and I find ourselves crying. I instinctively reach out to touch his arm in a small act of trust and empathy, then immediately withdraw my hand, knowing the watchful guard will misconstrue the gesture. It's a moving experience, swapping recollections of our journeys from the familiar and bucolic into the disempowering and fearful world of institutions. Here's a high-security prison, mine an emergency hospital ward. We talk with greater urgency and intensity, more of a conversation than an interview. Some 20 minutes later, the officer comes over to return him to his cell, but before he re-enters the building, Arvid turns and makes direct eye contact with me again. Ignoring the bustling presence of the guard beside him, he takes my hand and, with tears welling once more, says, "Thank you for sharing your story. No one has spoken to me like that for a very long time."
Thank you. So for those who haven't read the book, Yvonne and I were sitting at a Christmas dinner about 5 years ago, and we hadn't seen each other because of COVID. And she says, "I'm writing this new book." I said, "Good." She goes, "It's about my work on architecture and prisons." And I kind of thought, okay, how many academic books and articles do you read? But then she said, no, I'm going to bring in stories about my ex. I said, "What do you mean you're bringing in your stories?" And then she told me a quick story about the ex who had left the house and had decided to live in front of her house. And I thought, mad as a hatter, but good luck on you. And then she sent me 4 or 5 pages, and I remember reading them and responding, "I think you're onto something a bit different here and interesting." So the book is basically 2 big blocks. It gets more complicated. One block is about Yvonne's, your interest in prisons, in architecture, and the potential of that. Yeah. On the other, it's absolutely replete with biographical details. Your father, your mother, some friends, people that you've met in prisons who have become friends, the ex, moving house up to what's infamously called here number 8, which forms a big part of it. And you're going through different times and you're jumping between these different scenarios thinking, why is she writing about all of these things? And it does so, in my view at least, seamlessly and coherently. So the first kind of thing that comes to your mind, having read the whole thing, at least me, and the question that I'm kind of intrigued with is, why the blazes did you ever think of writing a book like that combines such detail and biography with intellectual academic curiosity in the rehabilitation potential of architecture in relation to prisons?
So it is a memoir. I mean, I deliberately tried to make it as far removed from an academic book as possible. It's not an academic book, it is a memoir. The book starts proper with me returning from Oslo as Norway swiftly and decisively locked down because of the COVID pandemic. I was giving a lecture at a conference and I had to get out of Oslo very quickly. And I described the journey home, which was quite panicky. You know, I had to get an earlier flight. Everyone was trying to get an early flight out because otherwise we'd have been quarantined in a soulless hotel in Oslo. And I describe coming through Gardermoen Airport in Oslo, which was empty. Heathrow was deathly. And then I got home to Cheltenham, where I lived at the time, and it was Gold Cup week, and there were 250,000 visitors to Cheltenham to go to the races. And it was at that time when, I don't know if you remember, but Boris Johnson was under some pressure to cancel Gold Cup, but he had tickets and he didn't. And I remember, you know, having gone through, you know, these desolate airports, sort of this post-apocalyptic scenario, standing in my front room, looking out of the window at streams and streams of people heading up to the racecourse and thinking, I'm going to quarantine myself, you know, I'm not going out there. So I decided that I was going to kind of lock down for at least 10 days. And then I thought, well, what am I going to do? And I'd just given this keynote lecture at a conference about my research at Halden Prison, which is where I met Arvid. And I thought, well, it's about time I wrote a book about my research. You know, I'd written lots of book chapters and journal articles, but I'd never gathered all my research together in a book. So I started writing an academic book about prison architecture and design. And about 3 days in, I was bored out of my skull. And I thought, if I can't interest myself in this project, I'm not going to interest my reader. So I started writing it in a more personal way. I started playing a bit fast and loose with grammar. I wanted to make it a very conversational book, very kind of intimate relationship with my reader. But I still thought of it as an academic book. I was thinking of it as an academic book that surprises. And then I met a friend, who's now a good friend, Andy West, who is the author of a book called The Life Inside, which is also a memoir. And it's another blended memoir. It's partly about his teaching of philosophy in prisons, and partly about the fact that his father, uncle and brother all spent time in prison. And Andy had really learned the craft of memoir writing, and he gave me lots of sort of mini masterclasses, and he gently nudged me in the direction of a very personal narrative. And yeah, there were things going on in my personal life at the time which I ended up wanting to write about, because actually the overarching theme of the book is probably that confinement comes in many guises. So I write about the end of a relationship. My partner of 25 years left me with a house that he destroyed. So that was quite a challenge. So I write about, confinement in long-term relationships, what happens when relationships kind of grow a bit thin, what it's like to find yourself single as a woman in midlife. I write about my alcoholic father and what it must have been like for him being imprisoned in a degenerating body. And I also write about freedom and the fact that freedom comes in many guises as well. So the narrative arc of the book is, it's all in the subtitle really, Reimagining the Prison, Restoring a House, Rebuilding Myself, pretty much sums it up. And I found it very cathartic to write it in that way. There's another narrative arc actually which is about prisons, but the personal story is about how devastated I was when my partner left me, how I rebuilt myself, how he then did this thing that dramatically changed my relationship with my house, and I had to kind of pick myself up and rebuild myself all over again, and how I went on to find freedom.
So that rebuilding comes out very strong as the book progresses, but it is, there's very clear foundations laid in the book about this sense of confinement in different aspects. And as I said earlier, you jump between different parts of life. So it goes back to childhood, father, then all of a sudden you're in Norway in a prison, and then you're talking about a particular prisoner here, and then you might be talking about the windows falling out of this cottage in Cheltenham.
It wasn't a cottage, it was a four-storey townhouse, terraced townhouse.
Four-storey townhouse,
Yeah.
and then the ex who wasn't fixing things at the pace or in the way that you should. As I said earlier, it's seamless. You think it's really difficult to think how you could start teasing out connections here. And then you've put it as confinement moving towards a story of rehabilitation or rebuilding or whatever. Do some of the connections work better than others?
Some of them came more naturally than others. So, for example, one of the prisoners that I write about is Harry Roberts, who is quite notorious in this country's criminal history. He shot and killed 3 police officers in London in 1966. And he was one of the first prisoners that I interviewed when I was doing my PhD research. And I spent quite a lot of time talking to him, and I found his story fascinating, not least because he was arrested 12 days after I was born, and he described being taken to the Old Bailey with a police escort, with police officers on motorbikes in tin helmets, and he was in this black Mariah behind them, and they went through crowds of football fans, and he became a bit of a kind of folk hero, folk devil. So at various London clubs, fans used to chant his name, Harry Roberts is our friend, he kills coppers. But But he was describing a world that I was born into, and it was like sort of stepping into a photograph, you know, the way that he described it. So I could relate his story to, you know, me coming into the world, and I described my parents, how they met, and, you know, what was going on at that time. So that was quite easy. Others were more difficult connections to make, and I'm really glad that you've used the word seamless, because I did work quite hard at it. I didn't want there to be sort of clunky gear changes. You know, I didn't want a chunk about prisons and then a chunk about me and another, you know, I didn't want it to be like that. I wanted it to be a proper sort of braided memoir, braided narrative. But when I got the first draft of the manuscript back from my editor, and there's a scene that I've written, I think quite, you know, I hope quite movingly, about visiting my father's grave for the first time 20 years after he died. And I describe how rattled I felt because I couldn't find him. I couldn't find the gravestone. And, you know, I described the sort of the sensory experience and what was going on inside me. And then my editor's comments come back with the note, "Can you relate this back to prisons?" And I was like, what? You know, how? And, it, you know, my heart sank because I just thought, oh, you're not getting it. But then I realised that I had referenced a young man, well, a child, a 14-year-old child, who committed suicide in a young offenders institution because his mother died on his 14th birthday. And he left a suicide note saying he couldn't stand to spend that amount of time in jail without being able to see his mother's grave. And so, you know, that made me reflect on the fact that I had chosen not to go and visit my father's grave when I could have done, and that what I would want to say to that young lad would be, you know, they're not there, you know, that's not them under the ground with ants crawling over them, you know, they're in us, they're in our hearts, they're in our DNA. If we're lucky, they're in our dreams, they're in the spaces that we, you know, we occupy together. And they're in our memories, and that's the kind of important thing that I wanted to reflect on.
So if you can see a theme cutting across it, or sets of themes cutting across these different events and personalities and incidents and things like that, any reader reading it there'll be parts that will surprise them. What part, when you were crafting the book, surprised you most? If any.
I mean, I was sort of surprised by my ability to do it. I didn't set out to write this book. You know, you don't know how it's going to turn out, and it went through many, many iterations. So, you know, actually I look at it now and I am really proud of it. I think you used the word brave before.
Yes.
And I think as an academic it is quite brave to write a memoir, because you don't go into writing memoir half-heartedly. You know, if you're going to do it, you have to really kind of put it all out on the page. So my ability to be vulnerable, I think, surprised me, and to realise that there's strength in vulnerability. In terms of the content, I mean, it's about me and my life and my professional life, so that didn't surprise me so much.
I did use the word brave. I also said it was gutsy. And when I said that the book was gutsy, precisely because you bring in professional and your personal life, inevitably some people, not inevitably. So the question is, will some people reading this be angry, annoyed?
Yeah, I mean, Daily Mail readers will hate it. I mean, the part of the reason that I read the prologue, because I don't think it is actually very indicative of the book in a sense. It sort of sets it up rather than being what the rest of the book is like. But I think the reason that I wanted to read that is because I wanted to demonstrate that I'm actually trying to puncture some of the myths about people in prison. I really want to encourage people to think about prisons, perhaps think differently about prisons, and about who we send to prison. And I would really like to think I had two aims really with the book. One is to make people think with more empathy and compassion about people in prison. I always think that any of us could end up in prison, you know, there but for the grace of God, or, you know, whatever, go any of us. And I always think that what connects us is greater than what separates us. And I always feel that when I'm interviewing prisoners. And the other aim of the book really was there's quite a strong kind of feminist underpinning to it. And I particularly wanted to inspire women, and particularly women of my sort of generation, and to know that if they are in relationships that have grown a bit stale, that they shouldn't be afraid of what's on the other side. You know, I was devastated when my partner left me. And I wish I'd realised that actually there is life on the other side of a long relationship, and it's very often a much more colourful, more vivid, more interesting, more exciting life. I mean, I would not have written this book and be enjoying going to all the literature festivals and things that I am now were I still in that relationship. So, you know, the sort of emails that I've had, and, you know, women coming up to me when I've done book signings and things and saying, you inspired me, that's been a really important thing for me. So yeah, but in terms of annoying people, I think the fact that I'm advocating for not only kind of just humane, civilized prisons, but actually far fewer prisons, and prisons that are imaginatively designed and really, you know, progressive and just, you know, enable us to think about people in prison radically differently. I think that's a message that won't go down well with people who think we should just lock them up and throw away the key.
So that takes me, I want to move away from the kind of crafting of the book and the mixture of your kind of biographical detail to more about the academic side. So again, I'm summarising in a way that's not doing justice to anyone. But I think Yvonne's just summarised where she is intellectually, which is about questioning prisons as places of rehabilitation and hope, as opposed to punishment and darkness and all of that kind of stuff. We all possibly live in different societies and how they think about prisons and what their aim or purpose should be. But one thing that's constant throughout the book is your many attempts over the years to start projects where prisons might be more beautiful and might be places of optimism and rehabilitation. But as you say once or twice in the book, we haven't really moved that dial forward much. So you might get initial enthusiasm and then it comes back to much of the same of what we have. And that's mixed in my mind with, you know, if you think about the United Kingdom, we've had this thing about tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. It's cut across the political spectrum in terms of, you know, various parties saying the same. And any politician who stands up and says, I'm going to be soft on crime, is absolutely committing suicide. So the question really is, and this is getting into more your academic argument or your intellectual argument, why has the message around prisons as potential places of rehabilitation failed in its execution so much?
Well, I think it's partly a failure of criminology, actually, that we haven't penetrated political discourses in the way that we perhaps should. I mean, I think I always end up coming back to the media. You know, the popular media in this country is pretty rabid, and there's no, it's not a popular cause, is it, to improve prison conditions? I mean, I think what the current government have started to do is already quite brave. But for so long, prisons have been a political football and, you know, used to sort of gain the populist vote. The idea of anyone standing up and saying we should make conditions better for prisoners, there's an assumption that that's a non-starter. I'd be really interested to read some, you know, rigorous research on what public opinion about prisons and prisoners really is. I always end up saying, you know, the vast majority of people in prison will come back out into society, and therefore it's good for all of us for prison conditions to be improved, because who do we want potentially as our neighbour? Someone who's been rehabilitated and given an investment in their future, an investment in society, or someone who has been brutalised by the environment they're in and the conditions and the regime, and being made to feel like an animal, and, you know, comes out of prison feeling even more brutalised than when they went in. You know, who do we want sitting next to our daughter on the bus or whatever? You know, I think it's really important for all of us that prisons treat people in a civilised way.
Mm. One of the interesting part of the books is you talk about female prisoners in Britain, and I might get the numbers wrong, but something like 15% of female prisoners might have committed, in inverted commas, serious crimes. And so you raise a question in it about, if I took 85%, those who haven't committed serious crimes, didn't send them to prison, I would save, what is it, £76 million a year? Something
Yeah,
in that,
I can't remember the
that
figure,
order.
but it's a lot of money.
£80 million a year, just by not imprisoning 85% of women who have not, for example, committed serious crimes. And then the question is, what would you do with £85 million for those same women? So that's the question. What would you do with £85 million if we gave it to every year and say there's a group of women, this 85%, and of course the same could be said about men, but let's focus on that one. What else could be done?
I mean, I'd really like a sort of wide-ranging public discussion about this, because I think that would inform the public. You know, going back to your previous question, if we started thinking about the amount of money that we, the taxpayers, spend on prisons and what we could use that money to do instead, then that immediately gets people thinking about why we spend all that money locking people up. So I'd like there to be a public discussion about what we might spend that money on. You know, should we be spending it on hospitals, you know, funding the NHS? Should we be spending it on schools? Could we be spending it on libraries, public parks, more public art? You know, there are all sorts of things. In terms of women in particular, I think we should be spending it on community facilities that will support women in getting away from violent men, for example. So that 15% of women in prison who are there for not just serious crimes but violent crimes, many of those women will have committed those crimes in self-defence. So the figure is 27% for men, so it's still not very high, really. 27% of male prisoners are in for serious violent offences, but the difference is that for women, many of them will have been committed in self-defence. So, yeah, providing, you know, really good quality housing and community support for women to divert them from prison, to prevent them from going into prison in the first place, to provide refuge when they come out of prison for them and their children. You know, there are all sorts of really good ways that we could spend the money rather than locking women up for non-payment of TV fines or shoplifting baby formula and nappies and that kind of thing, which is, you know, what we're currently doing.
Okay. So it takes us into this idea and where you place architecture in this vision about prisons and rehabilitation and hope. So this is where Yvonne really can claim to be world leading in terms of that connection between architecture, prison, and let's say optimism and rehabilitation. One of the more reflective pieces, at least in my view, was the bit that you write, and it was a key to me understanding better the interest in architecture of Charles Jenks, who died of cancer and
his wife died of cancer.
His wife died of cancer. And Charles, in the book it says, Charles believes if there is an architecture that can help us live better as human beings, it's not a hospital. And so in a way, Yvonne's taken that key idea and thought about it, worked through it in terms of prisons. And so, I mean, the question for me, I get that as a point, but the question really is, let's take better architecture in relation to prisons. how far would it take us towards where you would like us to be? In other words, what's the power of architecture on its own in terms of getting to that place where we might have more rehabilitation, more supportive environment for people who are in custodial sentences? So it's the significance and weight and potential of architecture to really make a difference, as opposed to, I don't know, other factors.
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say about that, at one end of the spectrum, the prisons that we're currently building in this country, so the two that have most recently opened, HMP Five Wells in Northamptonshire and HMP Foss Way in Leicestershire, and then there's another one just about to be opened, I think, early next year in North Yorkshire. These prisons don't have bars on the cell windows for the very first time in this country's penal history, as a result of my research and the presentations that I gave to the Ministry of Justice back in 2014, 2015, 2016. And at that time, the conversations that I was having with the MOJ were around whether we could have horizontal bars on windows rather than vertical bars. And the answer came back, well, we can have horizontal bars for women and children in custody, but for adult men, it's really important to have vertical bars because that signifies punishment, which I sort of despaired, because there's no need for bars on windows. You know, bars on windows came in when there was no glass in windows, so it was to prevent escape. So it's all about the symbolic function of bars. So the important thing about that, I'm proud of that impact that I've had. It is significant. When you walk into a cell at HMP Five Wells, there's an awful lot that's wrong with Five Wells, but the cells are actually well designed, and they've got big windows, no bars, views on one side into the sort of prison village. I say that it's like a sort of communist block, but you know, you can see people playing five-a-side football, and you can see people coming and going. On the other side, there are views to the countryside, so verdant hills, the River Nene, Fishing Lake. It's absolutely beautiful, and that makes a difference to people's quality of life, their mental health, their emotional well-being. There's lots of research about the importance of views of green space. So that's important. But the more important thing, I think, is what that says about us as a society, that we don't require those symbolic vertical bars on windows. We don't have this kind of very uncivilized, atavistic image of prisoners. We see them as fellow human beings. So for me, that's the important thing. The fact that story made the front page of the Daily Telegraph, as I say in the book, makes me think that we're not that enlightened after all, but there you go. But at the other end of the spectrum, I think architecture is important, and it can help to achieve rehabilitative aims if taken as far as we can. So I talk quite a lot about Limerick Prison, Limerick Women's Prison in the book, which is one of the prisons that I had most input into the design literally from the ground up. Helped to write the design brief. I persuaded the Irish Prison Service to hold a design competition, which never happens in this part of the world. We shortlisted 4 different consortia of architects and constructors, and they basically had to compete for the tender. And I gave lots of presentations on my research. I asked them lots of questions. One of the questions that I asked the architects, which caused some consternation because they'd never thought about it, was if one of your relatives was imprisoned in this prison that you're designing, would you be satisfied that they were not only going to survive and be treated decently, but that actually they could flourish, they could really thrive? And they'd never thought to ask themselves that question. So the prison that we ended up with, I think it is world leading. I talk about the compromises that were made in the book. It wasn't 100% how I would like to have seen it turn out, but it is imaginative. It is really forward thinking in many ways. It feels very domestic in size and scale. It's very human scale. You mentioned Charles Jenks. He was behind Maggie's Cancer Care Centres, if you know anything about those. So I use Maggie's Centres as an exemplar. They make maximum use of natural daylight, but they are also very domestic in feel. The materials used are very tactile, so tulip wood and that kind of thing. Beautiful views, all that sort of stuff. So I showed the architects at Limerick all the photographs of Maggie Centres, and they really took that on board. So the accommodation unit at Limerick has a massive oval-shaped skylight in the roof, which means that the light absolutely floods in to the accommodation unit. There's artwork everywhere, all over the walls, velvet sofas and armchairs scattered all over the place. The bedrooms, they don't call them cells, are really well designed. There's lots of really nice design features. I mean, even little things like there's a ventilation panel on the side of the barless windows, which all look out into the courtyard garden. And the ventilation panel has a full-length mirror on the back. And for some of the women going in there from the old Limerick prison, it will be the first time that they've seen their full body reflected in a mirror. For one woman in 18 years, because in the old Limerick, which was built in 1825, second oldest working prison in Europe, they just had those, I don't know if you've ever seen them, ever been in a prison, but prison mirrors, it's like looking at yourself in the back of a tablespoon. They distort. They're not proper mirrors because mirrors could be broken and the shards used for self-harm or as a weapon or that kind of thing. So even that one little thing, that's really major. I talked about the importance of light, and the architects have fitted 2 different kinds of light bulbs in the cells, in the bedrooms, so that the women have autonomy. They can choose between a warm white light or a deep indigo blue light, which is supposed to be psychologically good for stress. But, just those little choices become really significant in prison. The women have a fridge and a kettle in their rooms. One of the walls has been painted with blackboard paint, and they're given chalk so they can write poetry or whatever they want on the chalkboard. All that kind of thing. When the women were taken from the old Limerick to see their new home, bear in mind the old Limerick is grim as hell. I mean, it's like medieval catacombs, the cells. There's no heating, there's just a hot water pipe along the back wall. A lot of the tiny windows are broken, they're barred like this, crisscross. The prison was refurbished so that bunk beds were taken out and they were made single cell, and in-cell sanitation was put in them. But the toilet in each cell is right beside the bed, so you put your head on the pillow at night and you've got this stainless steel toilet without a lid, right beside you. So it was horrible. So then the women were taken out of that environment and shown their new home, the new Limerick Women's Prison, just before it opened. And apparently a lot of them burst into tears at the sheer niceness of it all. So things like that, I kind of think, I say in the book, I do sometimes feel like Sisyphus sort of pushing the boulder up the mountain. Ever optimistic, but always, also kind of realistic and realistic about the fear of failure, which is always there. But when I hear things like that, I think my research has made a small difference to people's lives, and architecture makes a difference. I mean, I said when I came in here, I'm really kind of acutely aware of my environment, and you all will be too, even if you're, it's not quite at the forefront of your mind. But the fact that here we are in a lecture theatre without windows has an effect on us, it has an effect on all of us. So, I strongly believe in the importance of environment and that architecture matters to all of us.
So to give you a sense of the connections that are made in the book, this argument is traced to various parts of the book, and then again it is as seamless as connections into Yvonne, and sometimes with the X, but at the end without the X, trying to architecturally renovate number 8 in Cheltenham, and the frustrations that brings, as we've all known, when you try to renovate a house. So the idea of architecture isn't just a kind of simple thing, it's a hassle. I want to move on again. I'm mindful of time, and it's a question that we rehearsed a bit in the sense that I raised it because it was the thing which I think challenged me most, which is the following, and Yvonne will correct me where I get it wrong. My sense from reading it and from what I know of Yvonne is that in principle, she's probably 99.999% against prisons. Yeah? So why spend your life, professional as well as personal commitment, trying to reform a prison? And that's, I think, a big dilemma for many people who operate in the social sciences, where we see social challenges, we would love to change them, and often we are dancing with the devil, to put it in a kind of an analogue like that. So the question really is, how do you deal, I mean, in the book you say you're not an abolitionist, so that's part. But you're also clear that prisons as an in-principle way forward isn't much of a way forward. And yet you've spent so much of your life frustratingly trying to build better architecture for the thing that you don't really see as taking us forward.
Yeah, it's a moral dilemma.
It's a moral dilemma. How do you get around it or through it?
I have a chapter in the book called Dirty Work, which addresses this head on. I mean, the problem with any kind of prison reform is that it doesn't challenge the institution of the prison itself. It supports and legitimates the prison to some extent. You know, you're saying, okay, you know, here's the prison, I'm going to make it look nicer, feel nicer, but you're not doing anything to challenge the institution. And that is a dilemma. And I get some flack for it. I mean, the idea of dirty work comes from Everett Hughes, the sociologist, who wrote a paper in 1962, I think, called Good People and Dirty Work. And he was writing about people who worked in Nazi concentration camps, but the term has since been used to describe, you know, the kinds of jobs that most people wouldn't want to do. So abattoir workers or sewerage workers, undertakers, prison officers. And I relate it to prison architects. There's a big movement in America led by an architect who I met called Raphael Sperry, who's an activist, who has lobbied for architecture practices in the States not to take on prison contracts. He says it's immoral to do so. And he's had some success. And, you know, I've spoken to a lot of prison architects who are really good people, you know, salt of the earth, compassionate, imaginative, humane. And they say, but I can't afford to turn down potentially lucrative contracts. You know, I believe in rehabilitation. I want to make a difference to people's lives. But my first duty is to the people who work for me and their families. You know, they have to put dinner on the table. So they say, you know, better that we compete for these contracts with our enlightened ideas and our knowledge and our experience than someone without all those things getting the contract. And I talk about that quite a bit in that chapter, and I reflect on my own experience because it troubles me, because I say the same. You know, when I'm asked by a construction company to help them with a bid for the new, you know, expansion of the women's estate or whatever, I think, well, it's better that I'm there than not. You know, someone with criminological expertise and knowledge of prisons and prisoners and a compassionate view and all of that. But, you know, am I kidding myself? So I do talk about that and where my boundaries lie and what my sense of integrity is. But actually, for me, the real ethical murkiness comes with what happens afterwards when you've designed a prison and you've done your best with it and you hand it over. And I relate an example. I worked on the design of a maximum security prison in Auckland, New Zealand, which was not a happy tale. We thought we could make a big difference. We thought we could design something that was as radically different as a max security prison could be. And we worked very closely with the prison governor and senior staff there, with the Department of Corrections in New Zealand. And we all thought that we were singing from the same song sheet. But then when we presented them with this beautiful, well-designed, humane prison, the Department of Corrections looked at it and said, oh, we thought that's what we wanted, but actually now we've seen it, we realise that what we needed was a newer, shinier version of the Supermax that we already had, that had been built in 1968 and is disgusting. And so that was a really salutary tale for me. You know, it was a lesson learned. The team was disbanded. The architects came up with what they were asked for, which was a supermax. And I feel a really deep sense of shame for having had any part in that. I visited it with my colleague Kate Gooch at the university here around the time that it opened. And there were some things that were better about it. The cells were bigger and brighter and lighter. But overall, it was just hell in a different guise. In fact, I think in many ways it was worse than the old Paramoremo, it was called, the old Supermax. It was a very sterile, sort of hostilely sterile environment. And, you know, one of the problems that often happens in these scenarios is that the staff are imported from the old prison to the new prison, and they bring all their, you know, kind of officious, authoritarian attitudes with them. So I fought really hard for a therapeutic garden in this new maximum security prison. And when Kate and I visited, as it opened, it was about 2 months after it opened, the therapeutic garden was all locked up. It wasn't being used. And it turned out it was because it had this water feature in the middle of it that was on a granite plinth. And this had been deemed a health and safety problem. And we were told that the issue was that a prisoner could hurl himself at this water fountain, this water feature, and split his head open in an act of self-harm. And the idea of creating a prison environment where someone wouldn't want to give themselves brain damage on a water fountain didn't seem to have occurred to anybody. And that was the sort of narrative throughout the prison. You know, when we went to the visits hall, we asked why the visitors for a prisoner were seated on wooden chairs, but the prisoner themselves had to sit on this little aluminium, very uncomfortable looking stool. And the officer showing us around said, well, so that they know they're second-class citizens, I suppose. So that ran through the whole place, and I ended up feeling really chastened and ashamed by my involvement in it.
I'm mindful of time, and we've tried to do a bit of the intellectual history, the biographical thing, the ethics of that, but I'd like to ask one final question, and if we can maybe briefly so that we can open up. So there's a reference in various parts of it to an article, a short piece, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Gilman, which I'd never heard of. But it opens up, and you've already referenced it, a kind of a more feminist approach in anchoring to, I think, your work and your own life. But there's an interesting part of the book where you say you've been asked to give talks on, is there a feminist prison? And then you kind of said, of course there isn't. So perhaps if we can have a minute just to see how that feminism has evolved as a standpoint, either professionally or personally, and how important that is to you going forward.
So the book was originally going to be called Beneath the Yellow Wallpaper because The Yellow Wallpaper as a book, as a novella, really kind of underpins a lot of the narrative. And it's a story, as you say, it's by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I think it was published in about 1892. It's a Gothic horror story, but an early pioneering feminist text. And it's about a woman who is imprisoned in the attic of a holiday house by her doctor husband. And she's suffering from depression, postnatal depression actually. And she's given what was very popular at the time, was called a rest cure. And she's not only physically confined in the top room of this house, but she's psychologically confined as well. She wants to write, and her husband won't allow her to write. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman was writing from life experience. She herself was given this rest cure. And Virginia Woolf was as well, as it happens, by the same physician. And both of these brilliant, talented women committed suicide within 6 years of each other. But the story is about the narrator's, the narrator's descent into madness. and she starts to see this form behind the wallpaper in the room she's in, and it's a woman behind bars. And as her mental health deteriorates, this figure becomes more demonic and her behaviour more erratic in the wallpaper, until eventually they're peeling off the wallpaper together. And the way this story is taught in schools and universities it's got quite an ambiguous end, but it's taught in such a way, it's quite a tragic ending where she commits suicide. And I actually retell the story and interpret it differently. I view her as not only surviving, but kind of stepping out into freedom. So for me, there's a redemption narrative in the story. But the reason it's important to me was that in all the time that my ex-partner was not renovating the house, goodness knows what he was doing, just destroying it basically, I lived in the attic of this 4-storey townhouse in Cheltenham, escaping from all the kind of the chaos and the violence and destruction that was going on below me. And as the house was being dismantled, I sort of became a bit dismantled as well. I was literally the mad woman in the attic. And so I really kind of related to this story about, you know, this brilliant woman who was psychologically confined and prevented from any kind of intellectual interest. And that kind of speaks to the theme of the book, that to some extent I think we're architects of our own imprisonment. And imprisonment comes in many guises.
Thank you.